So why would you want to paint in the snow? It's cold, you have to carry a bunch of gear, the driving sucks, tired after. Why bother? My answer is, look at it. It's awesome. Plus, when else are you going to be able to dress like a ninja and get away with it? So there's two main types of snow painting. There's a day like today, which is a lot of gray, a lot of overcast, usually when it's snowing. It looks like a day like today. The other type of snow painting is typically after it snows. You'll get a lot of bright sunshine, and that's where you get real deep shadows. Look at this scene. It's amazing. The things that you get out of snow painting, you just can't find anywhere else. And this is a good example. You know, a lot of times people are attracted to these bright blue shadows, which are all about canopy light hitting a white surface and reflecting all kinds of blue light. And it's a great study in the shifting tones. It starts to shift blue, and then as the mountains turn over, you'll start to see warm. That's all the light from this tree hitting up into there. And as you come down, it actually gets warmer and warmer and warmer, these snow holes. And every time you see a curve, you're getting all those value changes and color shifts within each mound. Plus, you get warm and cool with plants and dead trees and all kinds of stuff like that. So it's a great way to learn how to control contrast and the balance between warm and cool, and how to study that in real life. If you look at this scene, we're under a tree, you can't really see any shadows. And that's because the sunlight coming through the canopy, which is all cloud cover, is diffusing like a nylon diffuser for a light. So it scatters all the light, and none of the shadows, they're still here. This patch of snow that I'm standing on is slightly darker than the snow that's totally exposed to the sky, but it's so subtle that you're not going to see a hard shadow line, and that's why. I think this is the view I'm going to paint, and what I like about it is on sunny, snowy days like this, the contrast between the shadows coming across the snow, and then the river, and then the bright spots of snow, obviously. So the light on the snow has a very particular feel. It's bright, it's cheery, it's sort of a contrast to all the cold. It has like an optimistic, uplifting feeling to me, especially when you can really capture the coldness of water and the blue shadows and everything kind of gets into our mind of feeling very cold. And then the bright, warm snow, sort of like a campfire, right? It's like a relief to all of that cold, which is really what I want to emphasize right at the base of this tree. And we get a little dappled light on that tree, which is always a little magical. So let's see how we do. Okay, drawing. So with this particular piece, the horizon isn't really visible, but we're going to place it fairly low, a bit more dramatic. Now these snowbanks are pretty specific shapes, and they're flat. This riverbed is pretty flat right here, where the trees come in or sit, and then our main figure of trees is in here, just looking for big shapes. There's kind of a log that's going in there. There's this neat log that I might accent, move over. There's this great shadow behind these trees. And there's a bank up behind here. Something like that. Now, a lot of people make the mistake of thinking that you have to and you should copy the scene exactly as it appears. I do not follow that train of thought. I think it's important to figure out what the idea is of the piece and what the story is, which might mean, just a time of day, the character of a tree or an object. It could be very explicitly narrative, like people chopping wood or fishing or whatever. Person walking their dog. But sometimes it's less literal, like in this case. There's just trees over here. So for me, when I'm looking at this scene, I'm trying to think about what's important. This is the most important, the light and the dappled light hitting this tree. Oh, this is fairly dark against that. And there's a dark shadow here. There's dark pretty much on this whole embankment behind it. And there's some gnarly tree branches I'm not really worried too much about here. But it's kind of think about it, one triangle shape of dark. There's going to be warm dark, this is cool dark where the shadows are hitting the bank. It's mostly snow in shadow. There's some secondary shadows here. All this will be in shadow as the snow comes across this bank. And at this stage, when you're composing a scene, you are making decisions. Whether or not you think you are editing a scene, you are totally editing a scene. Because you have to. Just the marks that you make in sketching something like this, you're deciding where to put them, which ones not to put, unless you have a photographic memory and you're copying the scene exactly as you see it, which most people cannot do, and arguably should not do. You're making decisions, and so you might as well lean into it and figure out what the point of your piece is, what you want to emphasize, and then cut out any elements that don't support that. I'm going to add there's another patch of trees here. Just kind of frame this one. I'm worried about spacing. I don't want all these to be evenly spaced. 1, 2, 3. Kind of zeroing in on this tree. But I'm not going to draw too much more. That's all I really need. I'm squinting at my scene. Yeah, this is really where I want to focus the attention. So, in my drawing, that's all I really need to worry about. Now, a scene like this is all about managing contrast. There's so much contrast going on between snow and shadow and light and dark. It can be really overwhelming. So this is where I'll also be editing down the contrast that I see to make it a little bit more coherent. Okay, let's get to painting. Now the sky, I'm probably going to have to come back later and hit that multiple times. That's just the nature of gouache and gouache on toned paper. It's just going to require that we go over it a few times. So this is really just to block in the sky shape. I know I'm going to cover a lot of this with trees. Some of it will show through. So I'm not being too careful about that. Luckily, it's above freezing at this point, so don't need much more than that. Now, with a snowy scene like this, I find it very helpful to find the darks and put them in first, because it's really going to add some structure to the whole scene. It's they're brown, but they're kind of grayish. It's like a grayish, warm brown. Kind of a purpley tint to it. So, putting in some basic shapes here, I will worry about the individual shapes of those trees and the lighter values within that shape later. And the light is already changing, so I'm going to have to remember how that shadow was casting behind and that this tree was illuminated. And then we're going to have to work around what we see versus where we started with the painting. This area back here, we've got a patch of trees. Add a little white to that to push it back in space, because it's further away than these trees. So take the same value, knock it back a bit, and just indicating the general shape of what that tree is gonna cluster is gonna look like. Now these are two of the same shape, so I'll probably just go ahead and fix that. Now this one stands alone. And this tree next to that. There's plenty of... Now this is really the tree I'm focusing on in this negative shape. I'm just painting around it really right now. There's a lot of dark in here on this hill as well. But there's some snow shapes in there too. I'm going to leave that for now. We're going to mix up some snow shadow. Always a critical mix to get right. So immediately I'm putting in some of these shadows. Because they're the other main focus of this piece. Okay. Looking at where this tree was, in terms of where the shadow was. Looking at the shapes that we're creating here. Adding a little bit of purple in the shadows that are closest to us, warming them up slightly, just to enhance the feeling of depth. Warmer things are closer, Cooler things are further away, that kind of thing. Little marks paired with big marks. I'm just going to fill this in on the hill here. Something like that. You really need that division between those two areas. There's a fair amount of yellow in the scene. A lot of these grasses popping up. So we need to control that carefully. Too much yellow in the background will really screw up the depth. So here we've got a lot of this grassy hill in the background. Is illuminated, but we want to show and tell that it's in the distance. Now, there's a bank right here, so hopefully that's starting to reveal itself. Might need to lighten this. I want to just soften that edge because it's not that important. Now we're getting more saturated of a bank grass color where we're in the trees, or right next to the bank here where the sun's hitting. There's a little bit here, and there's a little bit right next to our tree of interest. So a little bit back here. So now you're starting to see a little bit of the light pattern reveal itself, given what we're seeing. Slightly warmer here, cooler back there. It's further in the distance. But not so noisy with tons of brush strokes where it doesn't feel like a shape. I need it to feel like a shape. And we can put little holes and indicate that those aren't hard edges, but we really want it to dissolve, more or less. Okay, before we go any further, I think we need to lay in some of the river. Now, this is tricky because the river is going in and out of shadows. Where these shadows are crossing the river, we get a very deep blue under color, and then we're going to have the sky reflecting on top of that color once that's dry, right? Because the canopy light is very pale hitting that, and it's in shadow, so it's going to catch a lot of that and not be influenced by the sun. So I'm recarving back like the edge of the river, which is a little tricky because water finds its own level most of the time, and it's gonna, if your rivers are off, like horizontal to the bottom of your picture plane, they're usually gonna look weird because water finds its natural level, and we're used to seeing that. So it's one thing that you want to watch for. There's a lot of stuff you can get away with in a landscape, but there's a couple of things like that would throw people off, and they might not even realize why it's throwing them off when they're looking at it, but that's one of them. Now this river color here is got a lot more yellow in it because it's reflecting some of these trees, so it's putting a little bit of this orangey warmth into the river here because it's reflecting all of this down. Then we get actual sky reflections, and then we got even more warmth here. There's a lot of very specific color things going on here. So that's the sky hole gonna be coming through. And this is gonna be our brightest yellow off this tree once we put that color in. So we're seeing that. But the sky is really the reflection of those colors, so our muddy dark will just be a placeholder before we put in the sky. So sometimes I'm putting the cool of the river in first, sometimes I'm putting in the warmth, sometimes I'm just doing it to keep track so I can come back to it and know what the hell's going on, because it is easy to get lost in a painting like this. Let's find our way. And I'm massaging this shape too. I'm using some downward strokes just because reflections usually kind of feel that way. And once the trees get going, there's going to be a lot of angles and energy in all different ways, and so it's nice to have some brush strokes that are counter to that, somewhat contrasting. So now our tree that I'm looking at is like totally not what we saw earlier. So again, when we're talking about making edits to what we see, unless you're literally chasing the light and you're so fast that you can keep up with that, I don't know why you would, but let's say you were trying to, you're always going to be editing, right? Because you have to remember where the light was 5 minutes ago. I'm looking around at other trees too to kind of gauge the temperature of that light. It's pretty pale. I'm squinting. It's very bright. It's very bright, but it's not. It doesn't have a lot of chroma to it. In fact, it's fairly gray with a little bit of a warm tinge to it. So let's see how we do. It's a little too cold. I think we need to put some warmth into it just to sell that it's actual light hitting it. Because the snow is actually the brightest thing, which might actually just remind me to key in my values the right way. That snow beneath it is going to be the brightest thing, so this can stand to go a little darker, a little more saturated. So I think what we'll do is just put some of the whites in, because it's important to, as far as the value plan, like this bright snow is going to be the key, like high value, super light. I'm switching to a clean brush just because it makes it easier to manage. But I'm still not using white. I'm mixing up a kind of a warmish tone, kind of a yellowy warm. And this will take several passes anyway. There's this neat log here We're going to use some of these shapes to show the form. I like to come up from a riverbank, because that's how the snow sort of rounds down and falls that way. We don't want to get too bitsy. This is about big areas. I can come in and noodle all that later. Now, going into the back, a hair lighter. Or, I'm sorry, not a hair lighter, a hair cooler. Just a hair. And what that's going to do is, again, push this closer to us and push this one further back. That gets back to that managing contrast. It's like we can't have everything super bright white, even though it feels like that when you're out here looking at it, because you're only ever looking at one part at a time, really. Your eyes can't really focus on more than that. So as you dance around and look at different areas of a scene like this, you're actually refocusing on an area, and you think that area is the brightest thing, and then you move on, and then you think that area is the brightest thing, and it's all a trick, because we can't really see all that stuff happening simultaneously. So that's why focal points are so important, is because it's telling you, we're trying to simulate it as if that is what you the viewer, are looking at. And everything else needs to vignette away so that it can read. Throwing in a little pink tones, because I see that over here. Might be because I'm getting some bounce light from some warm trees above. But it feels pinky to me. Ooh. And we're going to finesse all this and come in with light shapes and different little, how we want to carve out these shapes is kind of the fun part. So we will decide that later. And since I know I have to come over the snow stuff again, I can add a little bit extra warmth to it to give it that feeling of light. And then I'll come over it with pure quote-unquote snow, and then it'll feel more natural, but I can exaggerate the underpinning light. Okay. So now we're really starting to see the shapes come together, I think. You know, if we squint, we see very clear shapes. I'm going to push this tree even further. On that warm side. Maybe we'll give it a little bit of a hint on this side. Not quite as much, because we don't want it to pull focus, but not that. A little bit. Maybe a little bit's catching in there, but that'll melt away. Okay, so that's kind of some gist here. We're getting, that's a good read off the bat. So now we'll start working into the branches of these trees, and getting a sharper brush. Then it'll help us define some of these sky holes and some of that stuff. You know, a lot of times when you're working around the focal point, you're doing a lot of this stuff elsewhere only to set up the focal point at the very end. Like, all this is preparatory, which is kind of annoying, but there's really no other way to do it. Now, a lot of these move in and out of warm or in the shadow and the light. So what I'm going to do is actually just slap in some of this warm that I'm seeing. Not too much. It's kind of a yellowy orange. A little bit more orange. Not being too particular about it. It's a little bit lighter in the back there. Right, because these, I don't know what these are, like cottonwood or something. But they're incredibly irritating to paint because the branches are like, they have like negative, like I don't even know how to describe it. They're really light a lot of times, meaning like the branches themselves are warm and they're lighter than the sky, which is very confusing. You look at it and you're like, oh, that's warm. And so immediately you start putting in an orange like this, but that's actually the darker layer. The lighter layer actually stands out against the sky. So when I come back through with the darker sky tone, which I knew I needed to do, we're going to carve away and hopefully those pop forward. It doesn't matter a ton in this particular piece because that's not the focus, but it is something I want to at least hint at, that the light is hitting the tops of these trees, right? So there's a bank over here. There's some areas that the sun is catching. And then there are other areas where not so much. And if you add some of that to the canopy there, it's going to make it feel like just sell the story of the light. I'm really trying to just find a coherent shape for a lot of this. And I'm really overpainting. Probably should have planned out these shapes a little better, but we will figure it out. Now, I'm going to come back in with some darks. And I'm going to find the shapes that are truly in shadow, because those are really going to give us our structure here. I'm looking, like taking every stroke basically and then looking up. Kind of a weird, wonky. I'm really trying to not get too enamored with all the shapes in there because this is the important part. This is actually too tall as well. So we're going to bring this down. Get a little smaller. Because there's some stuff behind. The other pain in the butt parts about these trees is that they grow in these like weird clusters of tons of little branches in there. It's just a nightmare. It's a nightmare to try to capture all that. So I'm heavily editing down. Picking and choosing. I'll throw in some purple into that dark just to get it to read off that yellow. A little bit more purple. Not too much. Just want that shape to read correctly. Sorry for my sniffling. Okay. I think it's time to come back in on the sky. Skies are incredibly tricky. It's a value problem, and it's usually one that throws you off. And I know that's going to be slightly darker when it dries, but I might even go even darker. See, now I can define some of these shapes a little bit more specifically. Taking some of the paint off my brush so I can carve into this with a little bit more precision. Decent coverage. Now I'm going to come in and work on the trees. So it's a lot of back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Especially with these big clusters of trees. Might lose some of that warmth because there's a lot going on up there. I need to keep squinting and just letting it go. And just picking a few thicken up some of these trees. I apologize. Again, back and forth, back and forth. Going real bright. Some of these. hinting at the lights in there. Not too much though. These ones are, that's pretty dark in there. Okay, I'm gonna let that dry, and then we're gonna work in like a last kind of pass through the detail of like some trunks and whatever. But now I want to get into the real darks, real darky darks. Which are right in here. And they're pretty warm. Hopefully you can see how that starts to read even better. There's one really dark. Now, unfortunately, I don't remember what I saw here, but I can use what's there as long as it's coherent with what I've got in the painting. I can use what's there. Can add some bits and bobs. There's this great stump here. Where this log is covered with snow, but there's gaps in the log. Thinking about that shape. There's a couple other little okay. A lot of gnarliness back here. We don't want to add too much noise, but we want to imply that there's some stuff going on back here. It's not just dead. Well, I've got this real dark. There's a rock here. A couple of other bits in there. And I'm going to put in some shadows where there's some larger quote-unquote rapids. I mean, I can just see some darks. That's all we really need in there. And then, this is always a nice touch. You throw uber darks underneath your ice. on a riverbank, and it really sets it apart from the water underneath. I think it gives it a nice little thing. It's just finessing this shape. Definitely more has a yellow tint to it as it moves up. Paint's getting sticky, partly because it's cold, but it will do that. Why am I covering up all those lights I put in? It's too much. Too much. But better to have them and not need them. Being a little bit looser with some of these marks. Just a gnarl of trees over there. I don't want to go too dark back in there. It's going to pull focus and move those forward. But there are some down logs and things that I do think add character to the whole scene, so it doesn't feel like there's just clumps of weird groomed trees and nothing else. It's not very natural looking. So we do need stuff to either break up these shapes, and it helps us cross these snow plains. When I add these like sticks, you put something in front of it, it immediately sends the preceding plane to the back. So anytime we can add more and more and more depth, that's what we can do. Or, you know, we can add a mark, push something forward. So like this mark right here. Just by doing that, it tells you this is in front of that, and it pushes that background back even further. The trick is knowing how much of this you should do. It's too much of a good thing. It starts to become distracting, and you'll never save a painting with detail. It's got to work without it. Otherwise, yeah, there's a big rock here. We'll come in with the light side of that rock. I think that's nice. There's a rock here, too. You know, you look at the shapes, and you don't want any repetitions or, you know, lazy shapes where you've made the same mark 3 times, 1, 2, 3. None of that, if we can avoid it. Alright, I'd like to finish off these trees up top, just so we can move in down here and kind of stay in here and finish this. So, I'm adding hints of what could be considered dappled light in the top. Just by doing some of these spots here and there, we really do give the illusion that it's not a solid mass. There is light going on. You just want it to be such that, oh jeez. It happens. I can clean that up. Just let it dry. Much more challenging scene than I kind of anticipated here. Can't get carried away with this, the dappled light in the upper canopy. That is going to be a death trap if I start adding too much contrast up here. This is all secondary. These sky holes, I think, really help give it some definition, and is kind of the final step in cleaning up those shapes, really deciding what's important, what's not important. And you can give structure to the branches by painting negatively. I think they just look better. But you want variety, right? Variety in the shapes, the sizes especially, the placement. You don't want clusters of patterns. Looks weird. So brains start to say, like, what's the order? Why is this the way it is? And it makes no sense. Okay, I think we're good there. I'm going to add a little bit more lights to the background hill. It's looking a little dead. And I think we need a special yellow that I might have. Yes. I don't use it a lot, but I do carry Naples yellow with me just for this reason. Kind of warm grass kind of in the distance. It's like a softer yellow. Add a little bit of burnt sienna to it, just to redden it up just a hair. Oh, just a tiny bit back there. Ooh, that wind's cold. The sun is hitting the front side of those grass banks more strongly than the top. So the front is actually the brighter side. And there's a couple of... I don't want that to get too bright, because then it starts to compete with this. And we're always conscious of what's more important. There are some of these, like, twiggy things. I'm just smashing the brush in there. I'll come in with a liner. I want to over texture. Kind of melt in. I'm gauging the difference between these two areas. Come back in with a little bit more of this purple. I'm thinking about my original plan and the vision. This big triangle shape in the background to tee up this tree. So if I start to lose that shape, I might need to come back in and fix it. And of course it's changing, so that doesn't make it any easier, but it's looking pretty good. Soften those edges. And then whenever there's snow involved, you want to make sure that you're at least hinting at snow being in the right places. Otherwise it looks too I don't know, contrived. Like there's gonna be snow back in this on this ridge. And the more we can sell that, we can do things like this. Right, snow moving in and out of shadow is what we're alluding to. But if you think about it, we're, if this sees a lot of sun during the day, it's not actually going to have a lot of snow on it because it's going to be melting. So it's all part of the story. Making it believable. Even if you've never seen snow before, I feel like there's a coherency of like logic that our brains do automatically that will tell us if a scene looks weird, looks bizarre. It's like the uncanny valley with CG movies and whatever. It's like we're just good at seeing when things are off, even if we don't know why, or even if we're not even aware of it, people know. So you can only push things so far. So any little cue like this where it's like, oh, yeah, I know that shadows are, when an object moves in between shadows, that this effect will come through. But people might not even be able to articulate why or when, what color it should be, whatever, but they know. Which is one of the reasons why we paint outside. The top part of this stump. Even those little bits add a bunch. Again, pushing it into the background. I'll get a liner brush so I don't F this up. A couple little darks back here. Don't get me wrong, I like painting all this snow with the contrast. I'm a contrast addict. But you do need to do it cautiously and be as intentional as you can with it, because it will totally run away with you. And even if it's accurate, man, it just doesn't look as good. You gotta be intentional. Trees don't grow in curves. Mostly, they grow with joints. Bip, dit, dit. Up to a knob, up to a knob. So the more you can draw or use your calligraphy to follow how trees grow, the more natural it looks. Even if it doesn't feel natural to do it. There's actually some... Again, I'm crossing the streams here to push those branches back behind those branches. But there's not a ton of contrast here, so it kind of all blends together, and you can forget about it. But if you start keying into those details, it hopefully helps sell it without being too distracting. That's the whole trick with snow. Anything involving snow or high contrast. So now I'm just doing a couple of little dappled light things. I'm not gonna get crazy. Don't get crazy. If you piece it apart, your brushstrokes, you can hint at bark. Like bark grows in trunks or chunks. It's typically separated like that. Okay, we're looking good. You know, a lot of this I might still simplify. I think taking the tape off really helps with trees like that to see. But I'm going to get a small brush. And this is where you start getting into like the final thing. Because once you get this bad boy out, you're in the home stretch. And you don't want to be painting too long for this with this brush because you're going to be adding too much junk. So, you know when you start pulling out the small liner, like the end is near. A lot of times I won't even do this part outside. I'll wait till I get home. But since I'm recording, I will give it a go. Now this is, you want to be real careful when you start cutting into your big masses of darks. You don't want to eat up too much of that, because it'll ruin it. It'll ruin it as one big shape and you add too much noise to it. I'm saying all this because I do this all the freaking time and I need to back off the contrast. I say as I'm adding more and more. But a couple of areas really do help. Watch. See when I start to add a highlight side to that, it just really sells the light. When you start carving into the negatives, I gotta fix these over here. You don't want to do too much. That's the thing. You gotta keep telling yourself, don't do too much. Just enough. People will fill it in. It's just to add a little bit of variety. We still have to do the river as well, so I'm trying not to get too literally in the weeds. Okay. There's this rock, and then we'll get into finishing up the water, and I think we'll call it good there. Any more, I'm going to start adding too much just for the sake of it. So we have rocks that have highlights to them. They're in the sun, then they're not in the sun. See how that helps sell that? Works great. I'm gonna add a little bit of, I call these grass puddles. When snow starts to melt, there's like little points of grass that linger or kind of poke through. Something like that. There's actually some of that up here too. I'm starting to get into that real touchy area of like too much detail, too much fiddliness. As long as it helps sell it, don't mess it up. You can't really mess it up, but you can make it better and you can make it worse. Okay, let's do some water. Okay. Doesn't need to be clean. It's kind of grungy in there anyway. But it is light, a very light value. But I don't want to lose the coherency of my shadow shape of like crossing the river here. I think that's even too light. Dirty it up a little bit. We don't need a ton. Try to keep it as much as like one shape as you can and not like a jillion other shapes. That's enough. There's a light, paler shape here. Kind of don't want to mess that up. Let's see. And it really does get into this light. I'm going to go dark with these ones, because our highlight is already in place there. Okay, looking good. A couple more little details here. Famous last words. I think Joseph Zbigniew always says, every mess up is always preceded by the words, "I'll just do this." Which is totally true. Cleaning up some of this.
I know I mentioned I might need to hit the snow again, but I might not need to. I think it's reading okay. Oops, still had some blue in there. Clean up that edge. Just be wary of more. Might not need it. It's a little cool. Warm that up. There we go. That's keeping the warmth that I want in there. Something in the water, catching the light. There's actually a gap in these trees that I think is going to work really well. Oh, yeah. Yeah. That reads nice. Just like sky holes. Now we have snow holes. Just a little bit of a hint of a rapid. Usually kind of green. Ooh. I don't know about that. I think we just added too much contrast. Which is okay. We'll just kick it back. It's important to just constantly be judging what you're doing. And then you gotta make tweaks, you know? As a beginner, you won't know necessarily what those tweaks are, and it'll be extremely frustrating, I get it. But the more you learn, the more you can judge what you're doing, and then you'll notice more, and then you'll fix more, and then you'll learn more, and you'll notice more, and you'll fix more, and there's fortunately no other way to get there. Just a lot of trial and error. Trial and error. I'm squinting, and I want like little fragments of this to be reading, but a lot less. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add just a little bit to this side where the light is coming in. I think it's going to read better as a before shadow, in shadow, after shadow idea. Again, I would probably do most of these details at home, where I'm really judging it away from the scene, and I can look at it accordingly, make those decisions, because it is hard when you're outside, especially if you've been painting for a good minute and you're cold and you're tired and whatever. You might tend to rush. And so just knowing that you can always go home and clean it up is awesome. Okay, so let's take the tape off and see how we do. My fingers are getting pretty cold, so I'm about at my limit. When you take tape off, pull perpendicular to the paper. It tends to rip less. And yes, this tape tends to tear up the edges of my paper, but in a 6x8 frame, this is gonna be hidden anyway, so I don't really care. So yeah, I like it, you know? The story was, again, about this tree, sort of this warm, optimistic light cascading in. We're maybe hinting at some melt coming. This is like pretty typical Colorado, like a couple days after snowstorms, things start to brighten up. That day of is usually dark and gloomy and gray and overcast and foreboding. This is really that upswing and optimistic look after the fact. So I'm pretty happy with it. Richard Schmidt, in one of his books, talks about how he could always tell when someone painted a painting in the snow versus painting snow from a photograph. He said that somehow, I'm paraphrasing, somehow being outside and being cold somehow gets into your painting, whether that's because you have to paint fast or it just feels colder and you exaggerate some of the cools. I'm not sure what it is, but I tend to agree with him. We bake in some kind of the experience about being out here, and that's what makes it awesome.